You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.
Wash gets really into painting scenes of the American Revolution. These are massive canvases, but they're really bad. One of them is actually hung in the U.S. Capitol, and there's a review of it in the newspaper that's so negative that Wash writes a letter and asks for it to be removed and says, just throw it in the Potomac on your way home. Although he continues painting.
Hello, and welcome to episode 385 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. After 6 years of living under the Articles of Confederation and the many dysfunctions of the Confederation Congress, a group of Americans decided to create a new national government that had some power to ensure that the new nation paid its bills on time, regulated trade and international relations, and had the ability to compel the states to act, when doing so meant serving the good of the whole nation. As we know from episodes of this podcast, the United States Constitution of 1787 gave many Americans pause about all the different powers the new federal government would be able to exercise, and about having just one chief executive, the president. Now, the fact that George Washington would likely serve as the new nation's first president calmed many Americans' fears that the new nation was actually creating an opportunity for a hereditary monarch. George Washington, after all, had already proven his commitment to the new democratic form of government when he gave up his army command peacefully and voluntarily. He had proven that Americans could trust George Washington. Plus, George Washington had no biological heirs, no sons, to whom he could pass on the presidency. But while Washington didn't have any biological children, he did have children. Washington had heirs, and today, we'll dive into the lives of these heirs. Cassandra A. Good is an associate professor of history at Marymount University. She's also the author of the book First Family, George Washington's Heirs and the Making of America. Using details from her book First Family, Cassie reveals information about George Washington's stepchildren, Patsy and Jackie Custis, how George and Martha Washington came to play large roles in the lives of Jackie's young children, their grandchildren, Eliza, Patty, Nellie, and Wash Custis, and the work Eliza, Patty, Nellie, and Wash Custis put in throughout their lives to be seen and recognized as the heirs to George and Martha Washington. But first, thank you again for another great episode suggestion. This episode is the result of requests for a conversation with Cassie about her book, First Family. All of your episode requests help keep this show vibrant, so please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know what areas of early American history that you would like to investigate. My email is liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Okay, are you ready to dive into the intimate lives of the Washingtons and their Custis grandchildren? Allow me to introduce you to our guest historian. Joining us is an associate professor of history at Marymount University. Before becoming a professor, our guest worked for the Smithsonian, where she gained experience in museums, public history, and new media. She's the author of 2 books, Founding Friendships, which you may recall from episode 94, and her latest book, First Family, George Washington's Heirs and the Making of America. Welcome back to Ben Franklin's World, Cassandra A. Good.
I'm so happy to be here again.
And we're really glad to have you back. Now, I really like the title of your new book, First Family, George Washington's Heirs and the Making of America. But I also find it a little bit curious because, quite famously, George Washington did not have children of his own. So I wonder if you could tell us a bit about who George Washington's heirs were and what drew you to study them.
Yeah, it is kind of a funny title in that sense. And when I first started working on this project and I was saying I'm going to be working on Washington's descendants, and people would say, well, who would that be since he didn't have kids? And there's not a good word succinctly for a title for the next generation of his family. But that's basically what I'm talking about here. But also, in using the term heirs, the people I'm writing about are the people that chose to present themselves as his heirs. So there's a whole bunch of people that I could have included. And originally, I sort of said, well, I don't know who I'm going to be writing about. And I thought I would be writing a lot more about nieces and nephews that he helped raise. some of whom inherited Mount Vernon. But what I found is that those people were not interested in being known as Washington's heirs. The people who were super invested in that were his step-grandchildren, the Custises. And those are the people that I would argue are actually Washington's heirs, at least in the eyes of the public, through a lot of the 19th century.
First Family goes really deep into the Custis grandchildren, George Washington's step-grandchildren. And we learn a lot about their lives as we read First Family, but it also sounds like his step-grandchildren through the Custis line weren't the only children that George and Martha Washington raised.
Right. The Washingtons had children in and out of the household at various points. So when George married Martha, she had 2 young children from her first marriage, Jackie and Patsy, and they were 6 and 4 years old at the point that George and Martha got married. So those kids were in the house. And then as they're growing up, at various points, both George and Martha had a lot of siblings, and often those siblings either were in financial trouble or one spouse had passed away and they needed help caring for children. So various children were coming, serving as secretaries for George Washington, or just living there and making a home at Mount Vernon with them for various stints of time. And so there were always young people in that house.
So Martha and George Washington had many different family members in their house at various times, calling Mount Vernon home. But Cassie, you focus specifically on the Custis grandchildren as being George Washington's heirs. Would you tell us about the Custis grandchildren?
Sure. And just to back up and explain where they come from. So I mentioned Jackie and Patsy, Martha's children from her first marriage. Jackie is John Part Custis. I call all these people by nicknames because they all have Part Custis in their names and it gets very long. Jackie got married very young to Eleanor Calvert Custis, and they had a whole bunch of children, 7 children really quickly, 4 of whom survived between 1776 and 1781. Those were Eliza, Patty, Nellie, and Wash, using their nicknames again. And these are the 4 step-grandchildren that I'm talking about in the book. And Jackie dies when the youngest of them is only 6 months old. In fact, his widow, it's not very long before she remarries and has another large number of children. This poor woman had, I think, adding up, we don't even have names of all of these. It's over 20 children, and only about half survived, if that. So there's a bunch of half siblings that once in a while peek out in the book, but it's really these 4 that really saw themselves as George Washington's heirs and had a really close relationship with George and Martha throughout their lives.
You mentioned earlier that Nellie and Wash Custis went to live with their Washington grandparents after Jackie Parke Custis died. Why did Eleanor's 2 youngest children go to live with their grandparents? Wouldn't the natural order of things have been for their mother, Eleanor, to have taken care of and raised them?
Yeah, this is an interesting question because a lot of people say, why would any mother give up her children? And also, why split up your children? And the fact is, this was pretty normal at the time period. Just as I was saying that were nieces and nephews coming to live with George and Martha, when there was a loss of a spouse, often it was considered too much for one parent to take care of. So there would be children that would go into an aunt and uncle's household, a grandparent's household. In this case, Patsy, Martha's other child, had died even before Jackie, and she really liked having children around. So part of it is that she wanted to have children in the house. And part of it was considered a big burden for Jackie's widow, Eleanor, to have to take care of 4 children. Now, we should keep in mind, she's not doing this alone. She has a lot of enslaved people. So how big is that burden really? How much of this is that Martha really wants to take in children? We don't know exactly when the kids officially moved to Mount Vernon. George is still away at the end of the American Revolution at this point. So there's still some turmoil in the household. But they are unofficially adopted by George and Martha and live with the Washingtons, the rest of the Washingtons' lives.
It's curious to me that Martha and George Washington decided to take in their 2 youngest grandchildren, Nellie and Wash, and not their 2 oldest grandchildren, who you'd think would be a little bit easier to raise. Do you know how the Washingtons decided which of their grandchildren that they would take in and adopt into their household?
I think in this case, it had to do with the fact that Eleanor's health was bad after having both Nellie and Wash. And in fact, Nellie was sent to be nursed by a woman somewhere on one of George Washington's farms. So it seems like probably that's the issue here. It's a health issue. And she was going to have a wet nurse for Wash anyway. And so at that point, it made more sense. It may also just be that in terms of the amount of labor to take care of two children that young, the Washingtons were offering to take that on.
That's a good point. What kinds of labor were the Washingtons offering to take on as they took in their two youngest grandchildren? You mentioned earlier that the Washingtons had a sizable workforce of enslaved people at Mount Vernon. So what aspects of Nellie and Wash's child rearing were actually not performed by the Washingtons, but their enslaved people?
Right. So it's really, as you're saying, a lot of the daily sort of cleaning, caring labor is happening by enslaved people. In fact, there's an enslaved woman from Jackie and Eleanor Custis's household that is sent with Wash and Nellie. And one of the older girls, Eliza, writes about being upset about having to say goodbye to this person who had helped care for her. But what George and Martha really are going to do that's more hands-on is supervise the education and upbringing of these children to make them into a gentleman and gentlewoman. And George Washington is certainly more hands-off earlier on in their childhood, as he was with Jackie and Patsy. He really gets more engaged when they're teenagers, especially with Wash, when he's trying to supervise Wash's education, which is a continuing struggle, as it was with Wash's father, Jackie. And then Martha really has Nellie with her when she pays social calls. She has Nellie at a lot of the social events that they're having during the presidency in the president's house. She's entertaining guests by sharing her artwork, by playing harpsichord. So she's actually sort of part of Martha's public face in this period.
What kind of relationships would you say that the Washingtons had with their Custis grandchildren? They took Nellie and Wash into their household, so it seems like they probably would have had a pretty close relationship with Nellie and Wash, but they didn't take in Nellie and Wash's two older sisters, Patty and Eliza. So it seems perhaps maybe they didn't have closer relationships with Patty and Eliza. So what were the family dynamics like for this first family?
Yeah, it's harder to tell in the case of Patty, later Patty Custis Peter, because we have so few writings from her. But Eliza, certainly, you get the sense she was jealous of her younger two siblings, that every time she visited George and Martha, she felt more at home with them, that they felt more like her parents. She never got along with her stepfather, David Stewart, and wrote of the evils of remarriage in multiple letters. I think in Eliza's case, she really saw George and Martha Washington as parental figures, even though she's raised by her mother and stepfather most of the time. For Nellie, she is incredibly close with both George and Martha's death really leaves Nellie so bereft that in some ways it seems like she never recovers from it. That she talks about how nobody ever looked at her with the kind of eyes that Martha looked at her with. She just had a really special bond with Martha, basically as her mother. Wash doesn't write in ways that are that emotional, but he was known sort of in papers through the rest of his life in the public press as Washington's adopted son. So in some ways, he is seen as Washington's son. The extent to which he was emotionally close with them is harder to tell, partially because of this sort of acrimonious relationship he gets into with George Washington over his education. But you can tell he is desperate to please his adopted father.
What did Wash's education look like, and how did it produce a somewhat acrimonious relationship between him and George Washington? What kind of role did George Washington play in young Wash's education?
This would have started with tutors. So there were tutors coming to work with the kids from a pretty young age. And one of those tutors is a little bit better known, Tobias Lear, because he also works as a secretary for George Washington during the presidency, and then also marries one of Martha Washington's nieces. So he's sort of part of the family. And George Washington asked Lear to help find a school for Wash when they moved to Philadelphia. And he's always keeping an eye on what is happening with Wash at school. When it comes to college for Wash, he starts out at Princeton. George Washington is writing the president of Princeton to check in on him. At first, the reports are good, and then he's finding out, well, Wash isn't doing so well. He's writing Wash these letters, admonishing him. And it gets to the point where Wash is so desperate to try and please George Washington. He writes him a letter about how he didn't go to this party because he thought it would be inappropriate. And it also mentions how hot it was. It was like 106 degrees. And George Washington writes him back and said, you could have gone to that party. And it wasn't that hot in Virginia, so I don't think it was that hot up at Princeton. It's just, there's nothing he can do at a certain point. George Washington is so frustrated that this kid is just not living up to expectations in the same way that his father didn't. His father was the same kind of student.
I wonder if his frustration, Washington's frustration with young Jackie and then young Wash, has anything to do with the fact that scholars have said that George Washington may have been a bit insecure about his own lack of a formal education. For example, when Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and a bunch of the other founders who were established lawyers with college educations debated, scholars often note how Washington just sort of stood back and listened rather than jumping in because he didn't want to interact with these educated men at this level. And yet, we also know that Washington was very interested in education privately because he had created a library for Mount Vernon and he was an avid reader. So it's not like he wasn't an educated man, he just didn't go to college. So how do you think George Washington's lack of a formal education may have informed his desire to formally educate first his stepson and then his step-grandson, Wash Custis?
It seems likely that for George Washington, first his stepson and then his step-grandson are being given opportunities he didn't have. I'm sure part of his frustration is that they're not taking advantage of those opportunities. Both Jackie and then Wash Custis, for them, first of all, we don't know exactly what's going on with why they're such bad students. So many people who've read the book came up to me and said, do you think they had ADD? I don't know. I mean, there's a teacher who says Wash can't remember something from one day to another. Is that because he just didn't care? This is somebody who knows he is going to inherit a huge amount of wealth in land and enslaved people and other property. He doesn't technically need this education. But George Washington wants him to have that education in order to be a useful member of society. And he sort of hints he would like Wash to serve the public at some point in probably some kind of public office. Wash doesn't end up doing that for various reasons. But it does seem like George Washington wants Wash to have the education in order to serve the public.
As you reminded us earlier, both Wash and Nellie accompanied their grandparents to New York and then Philadelphia while George Washington served as the first president of the United States. And when we think back on the history of famous first families, right, we think of Theodore Roosevelt and his children in the White House, or the Kennedys and their children, and even most recently, the Obamas. We don't tend to think about members of the early republic as having first families in the president's house, later the White House. But as George and Martha Washington demonstrate, they did have young children while George Washington served in office. So I wonder, did the Custis grandchildren experience that celebrity-type childhood that usually goes along with being the child of a president? Or did the public in this era simply have different interests beyond following the lives of President Washington's grandchildren?
They are clearly celebrities. From the moment they arrive in New York, there's this huge parade, and there's a description of Wash getting sort of lost in the aura of the parade. So from the beginning, they are in the public limelight. Everybody knows who they are. And the president's house at this point also, it's not like the White House that has an east wing and a west wing and separation between domestic spaces and public spaces. In the president's house in Philadelphia, their bedrooms are on the second floor and Washington's office is on the third floor. So every member of cabinet coming to a cabinet meeting would have had to go past the kid's bedroom just on the stairs in order to get to a meeting. So they really can't hide from this, even if they wanted to. The other way that the public knows who they are is this portrait of them by Edward Savage of the Washington family, which was really made in order to be made into prints. And so many people had prints of this in their house long into the 19th century. And so the images of the younger two in particular, many Americans, this is not an era you would have recognized people that were famous usually because of limitations of printing and there's not photography yet. But many people would have seen these two kids. And Nellie's famous enough even that there's a wax figure of her with wax figures of her grandparents towards the end of the presidency. So yes, they're absolutely celebrities.
How old were Nellie and Wash at the time of George Washington's presidency? And what did growing up as an American celebrity mean for how Nellie and Wash experienced their childhood?
They're like 8 and 10 years old when this starts. And I think their mother is especially worried about what this is going to do to them and the way they're going to be spoiled, partially by the public attention and partially by Martha herself. There are letters between their mother, Eleanor Custis, later Stewart, and Tobias Lear, the tutor, saying sort of like, keep things in check, make sure this doesn't go to their heads. She doesn't want this to go to their heads. I think in some ways it really does. There's not much that could have prevented that. And I think it must have been difficult for the kids at times too. I think especially during the second term of Washington's presidency, when a lot of people are attacking George Washington. He's not that popular in his second term. And I can imagine that the atmosphere in the House must have been pretty tense, since that's where all those acrimonious meetings were happening, was right in their house. So I do think that this shaped how they thought about politics. I mean, Nellie is virulently Federalist at a certain point. Her sister Patty, even more so for the rest of her life, long after the Federalist Party has collapsed. So it definitely influences the way they think about politics and the fact that they're able to maintain fame for the rest of their lives.
What about opportunities? Do the Custis grandchildren receive any opportunities because of who their grandparents were? Today, we know that presidents' kids get preferred admission to the schools of their choice or concert tickets. What may have been the equivalent in the early Republic period for Nellie and Wash?
That's an interesting question, because I think any wealthy family in New York or Philadelphia at that point probably could have gone to the new museum, the Peel Museum, or they went to the circus. We know from Washington's financial records all the different things they were going to, all the different entertainments. So I'm not sure that they were getting any special access in that way. Chances are they were getting better seats, and college admissions was not as competitive back then. So I'm not sure that they got special treatment in that way. But in the sense that there was a certain public deference to them and the ability for them to have their voice heard publicly, to get things into the newspaper whenever they wanted. Wash gets invited to give speeches all the time throughout his life. So they're basically given, I think, a public platform that they wouldn't have otherwise had.
Speaking of those public platforms, today it's widely known that children of the president and first ladies adopt public causes or start initiatives because they have these public platforms that they get because they live in the White House. Did Wash or Nellie adopt any benevolent causes while they were in the president's house, or even after they were in the president's house, that they could promote because they had this special celebrity and public platform?
Definitely Wash and his wife Molly did. Nellie and Eliza and Patty not so much. But for Wash, early on, it's agricultural reform, and he wants to create an American breed of sheep. I don't write a whole lot about sheep in this, but I had to read a lot about sheep because he does these sheep shearing contests every year, and he sets up George Washington's camp tent from the Revolution that's now at the Museum of the American Revolution, part of it. He sets this up for a big meal and gives prizes for the best sheep. And he's trying to create American-made wool that can compete with like merino wool from Europe. He never really achieves that, but this is sort of his quest as a young adult. And then later on, really through his wife, Molly first gets involved in the American Colonization Society to support colonization of freed Black people to Liberia. He joins afterwards and then pretty much yearly gives speeches there. He and his wife, Molly, are both involved in that cause for quite a while.
How did Wash come to pick agriculture? And I ask because I've also read a lot of letters about merino sheep and people who are interested in this topic, specifically Elkanah Watson, who in New York, he drove the invention of what is now considered to be the state agricultural fair system. And I did read plenty of letters between Watson and Robert Livingston talking over and over about merino sheep and the wool they produce. So it does seem like sheep, and merino sheep in particular, were a big topic of conversation in the early years of the Republic.
Sheep are a big deal because merino sheep, you could not legally take them out of Spain. And so David Humphreys, who works with George Washington as a secretary and then later as ambassador, is able to like sneak some sheep out of Spain at a certain point. So yes, sheep were apparently a big deal to people because of how much wool people are wearing. We don't have the cotton gin yet, so there's not as much cotton. And I think for Wash, it's interesting because agriculture and agricultural self-sufficiency was more of a Democratic Republican issue than a Federalist issue. So this actually got him some support from Democratic Republicans, but he also wanted manufacturing of wool to happen in the United States, which is more of a federalist position. And I think he really saw this as going from his step-grandfather, George Washington's interest in agricultural reform. If you read Bruce Ragsdale's excellent book, Washington at the Plow, you learn a lot about how interested George was in agricultural reform and improvements. And so in a way, I do think he sees himself as carrying on that legacy and in some way serving the public in the way that George Washington wanted him to. I don't think George Washington was ever quite this parochial in his interests in terms of public service, but this is sort of the best Wash is able to do.
So even after Washington died, Wash was still really trying to gain his grandfather's approval.
It does feel like that in a way. And every single speech he gives, no matter what the topic is, it's about George Washington. Whether it's a celebration of St. Patrick's Day later on, he supported the cause of Catholics in Britain. Whether it's the sheep shearing festival, whether it's the War of 1812, it's always about George Washington.
Now, when George Washington resigned from the presidency and he gave his farewell address in September 1796, he basically told the American people that they lived in politically fractious times and that they really shouldn't allow for the rise of political parties because their democracy would be in danger. And yet, we know the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists were the first party political system that formed in the United States. Cassie, how did Wash, Nellie, and even Eliza and Patty deal with the rise of political parties during the early Republic? Did they try to eschew them like their grandfather had wanted the American people to do?
No, they were definitely real partisans. Probably Wash the least so out of them, but Patty, Wash, and Nellie all identified as Federalists. Nellie talks in pretty harsh terms about Thomas Jefferson after Jefferson becomes president and basically says, I'm not going into D.C. right now because I don't want to see those people. So she sort of steps back as the Democratic Republicans are in charge for a while and doesn't engage a whole lot politically until, weirdly, Andrew Jackson comes on the scene. Because for her, honestly, it's more about war heroes and for Wash than it is about actual political ideology. But for a while, she stays true to Federalists. Patty is such a Federalist and so pro-British that during the War of 1812, after the British burn the public buildings in Washington, which she has seen from the windows of her house in Georgetown, she goes down to see the wreckage with her husband and talk to the soldiers. She talks about how nice these British soldiers, Wellington's men, are and what gentlemen they are. And then she has a baby 6 months later who she names Britannia Wellington. So the level of pro-Britishness here, that goes beyond any kind of federalism George Washington would have ever had. And Wash, when the Federalist Party dies with the War of 1812, he becomes much less partisan. And he sort of picks candidates he's going to support, but he goes to the inauguration of every president. It's just Eliza who, I think partially because of the man she marries, Thomas Law, and his political beliefs, she's a Democratic Republican. She is in with the Jefferson administration. She's friends with Aaron Burr. She is friends with Dolly and James Madison. And so she's actually more of a political player in those early years of the city just because she's a Democratic Republican. She, too, ends up being a Jackson fan, though. Again, the war hero thing is important.
Naturally, you would assume that Wash, as a man, would go on and be able to talk about political candidates, endorse them for office, and have a somewhat political career because he was a man and that was seen as okay. But to hear you speak of these Custis women and how they were also political, these women came of age at a time when there were ideas about Republican motherhood and that really the domestic sphere is where women belong. They shouldn't have been interacting with politics. So were the Custis women allowed to have more political views than average women in the early American Republic because of who their grandfather was, George Washington? And were they allowed to speak publicly in ways about politics that average women would not have been allowed to speak of publicly?
I've done a lot of research over the years on women in politics and wrote about this some in my first book, and we'll be writing about it in my next book. But I do think women were talking about it more than we think. But certainly the excuse that these women were able to give of why it was okay for them to talk about politics at a time where women very much were criticized for talking about politics was they're George Washington's family. That's why they can talk about this. They have an opinion that's worth listening to because they're related to George Washington. Now, for Wash, it's interesting because He does not actually go campaigning for a candidate until Zachary Taylor's election in 1848. And there's a particular reason for this. Wash lives in Arlington, Virginia, which if you look at a map of DC now, you see that it's a partial diamond, and the rest of the diamond is Arlington County and Alexandria City on the other side of the river. That was part of DC until 1846, which meant at this point, people in DC didn't have a vote for president. Wash didn't get to vote for president until 1848. That was the first time. And it made the newspapers that Wash Custis, George Washington's adopted son, is voting for president for the first time, and he's endorsing Zachary Taylor. So this meant he couldn't vote for Congress, for president, and he also couldn't really run for office. So in some ways, he's not very far ahead of where his sisters are in terms of what kind of political voice he has.
Now, before we move into the domestic lives of Washington's grandchildren, I have one last political question. The early republic was a time when people were trying to figure out just how much power the federal government should have. And this was a time when you had people like George Washington and Alexander Hamilton and many Federalists advocating for more national power. But you also have plenty of people who are arguing that no, rather than give the federal government a lot of power, it's the states who are closer to the people that should have more power than the national government. Cassie, did the fact that Nellie and Wash grew up in the rooms where it was happening, or rather in their house, the president's house, which served as a seat of national government, did their upbringing in the president's house make them more nationalist? Or were their ties to Virginia so strong that, like many others, they wanted to see the states have more power than the national government?
That's an interesting question because I think they are much more sort of nationally minded than, say, the nieces and nephews of George Washington, who are, we would just say, upper middling planters and identify as Virginians. Because Nellie and Wash have lived in New York, they've lived in Philadelphia, they both travel to New England at certain points, and, they have more experience of the rest of the country. I don't think that they're sort of as provincial as we think of some Virginians being at this time. I do think they have a more national outlook. And certainly as the Civil War approaches, Wash makes very clear that he supports the Union. And even back, when nullification, when that crisis is happening and South Carolina is talking sort of about seceding, both Nellie and Wash are very against this. And there's a comment from Nellie's daughter that she's not going to be interested in any men. She's looking for a husband at this point. She doesn't want any nullies, people who are supporters of nullification. So the family, yes, I think absolutely has a more national orientation.
I think we have a sense from our conversation thus far that George and Martha Washington adopted their two youngest grandchildren into their immediate family, and they basically treated Nellie and Wash as though they were their own natural children. But a curious fact of history is that neither Nellie nor Wash inherited Mount Vernon when George Washington died. Cassie, after we get back from thanking our episode sponsor, would you please tell us why neither Nellie nor Wash inherited Mount Vernon? On June 19, Americans will celebrate Juneteenth, a national holiday that commemorates and celebrates the end of slavery in the United States. My colleagues and I at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation invite you to come spend Juneteenth with us. Colonial Williamsburg's Juneteenth celebration will be spread over 3 days this year, from Sunday, June 16 through Wednesday, June 19. We have lots of great programs and events planned that commemorate emancipation through themes of family, resilience, achievement, and spirituality. Master blacksmith Darrell Reeves and his apprentice Karina Rocca will be giving talks and working in the Colonial Williamsburg blacksmith shop, demonstrating 18th and 19th century traditions of African-American ironwork. Acclaimed storyteller Sheila Arnold will help us embrace the power of hope, resilience, and the unyielding desire for freedom in a couple of different programs, including Permission to be Free, a Juneteenth story. And the world-renowned poet Nikki Giovanni will speak at Colonial Williamsburg's annual Juneteenth sunrise service. Plus, my colleagues throughout our art museums and historic area will offer special tours, performances, and programs. So please, come to Williamsburg and join us. Visit colonialwilliamsburg.org/Juneteenth for a complete list of Colonial Williamsburg's Juneteenth festivities and how you can plan your visit. That's colonialwilliamsburg.org/Juneteenth. And if you do come to Williamsburg, let me know you're coming, because the Innovation Studios team and I will be walking around the historic area supporting and enjoying these great programs. A curious fact in history is that as close as Nellie and Wash were to George Washington, neither of them inherited his Mount Vernon estate. When George Washington died, his famous estate passed on to his nephew, Bushrod Washington. Cassie, would you tell us why that was? Was there a law that said you can't bequeath the biggest portion of your estate to family members who are not blood relatives?
So this is interesting. There's not a law that says that per se, but adoption is not yet a legal tool. That's not going to happen in America till the 1840s. So they're not formally adopted. He's not even their formal guardian. Their stepfather becomes their guardian. So he doesn't even have control over their finances. He only becomes Nellie's guardian because she requests that he become her guardian when she gets married to Washington's nephew, Lawrence, so that he can give her away in the wedding. So he really doesn't have any legal control over them. He does say in his will that he has seen them and treated them as if they were his children. And even with adoption, when adoption becomes legal, if you didn't have a will, your property would not automatically go to adopted children. It would go to blood relations farther out first. But I think that the real reason that George doesn't give Mount Vernon to them is that they are going to inherit their own property. So he knows that Wash is going to inherit property from his father, this property at Arlington, as well as some other property that George Washington gives him, and a ton of land in the Tidewater plantations there with hundreds of enslaved people. And then he gives Nellie and his nephew Lawrence, who she marries, part of his Mount Vernon estate. There are 5 farms, and he gives them one of the farms to build a house on. And by the time he dies, Eliza and Patty are already married with households of their own. So Bushrod is the eldest son of George's eldest full brother, which by traditional law of descent would be the natural person. He's also probably the most successful of any of the nephews, even though he's not actually going into politics in the way George had hoped. George wanted him to run for Congress. There's a letter from Bushrod basically apologizing to him when he takes a seat on the Supreme Court instead, because that's not seen as prestigious. So Bushrod, is not inheriting the same amount as the Custis's are. He sees Bushrod as a promising member of the family. By blood descent, it makes sense for Bushrod to be getting that house. But I should note that when Bushrod gets the house, it's literally just the house. He doesn't get the enslaved people, and he doesn't get any objects from the house, because Martha inherited everything at George's death. And then Martha's will said that there would be a sale to raise money for her nephew's education of everything in the house. We're talking down to like farm tools, water pails. There is nothing left other than a few things that Bushrod bought when he moves into that house.
So did the Custis grandchildren inherit anything from George Washington?
They do. He basically splits the estate up financially and with pieces of land into different parcels, and the kids all get some through that. And then, of course, Nellie and Lawrence get what becomes Woodlawn Plantation out of his estate. And then they get some specific objects in Martha Washington's will. So Wash Custis is going to get all the family silver, some of the china, and then the girls each get certain important household objects, portraits, pieces of furniture. But then anything that's left gets sold, and the Custises buy almost all of it.
The Custises sound like they were very wealthy people. They not only had lands that they inherited from the Custis estate, which you mentioned, but also enslaved people. And it was pretty typical for a lot of elite early American families back then to keep a lot of their wealth invested in human beings and enslaved people. But you do have this contrast where George Washington quite famously stipulated at the end of his life that as soon as Martha Washington died, any of the enslaved people that he owned would be free. So, Cassie, did Washington's decision to free his enslaved people impact the Custis grandchildren's relationship with slavery and their own enslaved people?
I think that George Washington hoped it would, but ultimately it does not influence them in the way he might have hoped. He had no control over freeing more than half the enslaved people at Mount Vernon who were owned by the Custis estate and were destined to be inherited by the 4 kids. However, those people had intermarried with the people he owned, so he knew it was going to be a problem when the people he owned were manumitted. And that's part of why he puts it off until Martha's death. Martha, again, doesn't have the power to manumit the Custis people. The children, there's not really discussion of them doing it. They're not going to do it. I don't think they ever had any interest in doing that on a large scale. So there's sort of two stages of separation where Martha ends up freeing the people before she dies on January 1st, 1801. And we assume that a number of them end up sort of staying, living nearby or even on the estate at Mount Vernon so that they can live with their families. But then once Martha dies in 1802, the 160 or so people that were owned by the Custis estate get split up 4 ways among the Custis children and removed from Mount Vernon to wherever they're living. And we don't really know, if there's a father who had been freed and then there's mother and children who were enslaved by the Custises. I know of one family, for instance, that gets divvied out to the Peter family, who, while they live in Georgetown, their main farm is in Seneca, Maryland, which is quite far from Mount Vernon. Does the father go out there and try and live out there with them? It seems not. There's a runaway ad at one point for a child from that family who the Peters suspect has come to find his father in the DC Alexandria area. So families are getting split up that way. And then also the Custises split up families between them. There's a family where the father had already been manumitted. The mother and 2 younger children go to Woodlawn with Nellie and Lawrence. And then the older son is sent to Arlington House with Wash Custis. So this family has been split up multiple times. And the Custises free a very small number of people over time. So Wash Custis frees the most, and these are mostly women and young children. And the understanding at this point is that these are his children through sexual exploitation of enslaved women. And so there's about a dozen of them. And that's, records from the time people said he had about a dozen kids with enslaved women. Another record said like over 60, which could be grandchildren also. Eliza and her husband, interestingly, free a group of people, but those are also family members. They're freeing their probable half-brother, William Costin, who's a year older than Wash Custis, and his mother and half-siblings, and later his wife and children. So it's pretty rare that they're freeing anybody other than family members, pretty much.
Would you tell us more about William Costin and whether the fact that the Custises likely had this half-brother, who would have been biracial, impacted their views on slavery, or at least in the ways they treated someone they knew might be a relative or was a relative?
I wish it could say that it meant that they realized slavery was wrong and manumitted people. But in fact, what we see is that over the years, they grow more and more pro-slavery. Even Wash Custis, who had been involved in colonization, which is sort of anti-slavery. Certainly the abolitionists didn't really see it as legitimate anti-slavery, but he becomes more and more pro-slavery over his life. His sister Nellie at one point says after the Nat Turner Rebellion in 1831 in Virginia, she blames it on Northern abolitionists, especially William Lloyd Garrison. She writes the mayor of Boston and says Garrison should be hung. And she says if these Northerners don't stop interfering with enslaved people in the South, that the white people would have to, and this is the word she uses, exterminate them. She uses the word exterminate twice. So this is not somebody who has any kind of enlightened racial views. It's pretty hard to read that kind of thing. And even Wash Custis, who frees a number of people and does free the rest of the people he owns in his will at his death, the people that live on his Tidewater estates are being so mistreated that other white enslavers are writing letters to him complaining about it. That has to be pretty bad. On the other hand, they do seem to have had a good relationship with William Costin. He, in fact, loaned them money a couple of times. He worked for the Bank of the United States, and he actually owned a couple of houses in Washington. He did quite well for himself. He was a very highly respected person, probably in some ways more respected than the Custises were. The whole city, all of prominent people turned out for his funeral when he died, and he was clearly able to build up some wealth. He also filed what's sort of a civil rights case against a racist law in DC that was trying to regulate free Black people. And he only sort of wins on a technicality, but he's the only one out of them that's really fighting the institution and advocating for the rights of Black citizens in any way.
So what happened to the Custis children? Did Wash, Nellie, and their sisters ever leave the early American limelight? Did they always stay famous?
So they stay pretty famous through the first decade of the 19th century. They fade a little bit in the 18 teens. All of them lose a lot of children. Nellie outlives 7 of her 8 children. So very sort of difficult time for them. But then when Lafayette comes to visit in 1824 to 1825, they see an opportunity to get back into the limelight again. They host Lafayette at their homes. They go and they're part of various events with him, and they seem to make sure it's getting in the newspaper. So their fame sort of rises again, also rises because they're big fans of Andrew Jackson. And in fact, Nellie's daughter marries a young man that Jackson helped raise as his ward. So they have this special tie with Jackson. Wash gets asked to do more and more speeches, actually, as he gets older. He also gets really into painting scenes of the American Revolution. These are massive canvases, but they're really bad. One of them is actually hung in the US Capitol, and there's a review of it in the newspaper that's so negative that Wash writes a letter and asks for it to be removed and says, just throw it in the Potomac on your way home. Although he continues painting, he is undeterred. So he's sort of known for that. His house is basically a tourist attraction. He has the most objects from Mount Vernon of anybody. And he also has this spring on his property down by the Potomac River where he has built like facilities for people to come and dance and have picnics and spend the day. And he'll come down and see people and have his enslaved people serve them food. He'll sometimes play music for them. He, more than any of them, stays public. Eliza also, she dies the youngest in 1831, but especially leading up to her death, she's sending all sorts of Washington relics. We can really call them relics because she's doing things like she takes a pair of black velvet pants that were George Washington's and cuts it into little square pieces and mails them to people, along with a word cut out of a letter by George Washington, and says, I'm sending you these things and remember him and remember me too. And she often refers to herself as his best loved child. So she's really trying to get people to remember her by tying herself to George Washington at the end of her life. And passes on, unfortunately, the relics that she passes on to her grandkids, she labels everything. She's not always right in what she's saying the stuff is or how it was used, but it's incredibly helpful for curators now that we have her little notes in everything saying what it was and the connection with her grandparents. So in that way, she's able to live on, I think.
I wonder if you think the ability of the Washingtons' grandchildren to stay in the limelight as long as they did was because they were George Washington's step-grandchildren, or because Americans had developed a nostalgia for the American Revolution and the early days of the Republic when George Washington was still alive.
Certainly the nostalgia that comes out of Lafayette's visit in the 1820s and builds in the 1830s helps them, and especially helps Wash, who's really interested in the American Revolution. In addition to those American Revolution paintings, he writes plays, some of which are set in the Revolution. Some of them have George Washington in them. So he's really sort of answering that nostalgia. And he is seen as somebody who was very close to George Washington, knew him intimately, and can tell these stories. He and Nellie especially are people who can relate those personal stories when there are very few people alive anymore that can. So I think in that sense, yes, the nostalgia. Also, they worked really hard at it. I don't think it's even just about intrinsically who they were as much as the fact that they put in constant effort. And this is part of what I try and point out in the book is that family itself is defined in part by how people choose to define it, the work they put into identifying with a particular family, rather than just about blood relationships.
So here's where I admit that I've always found it fascinating that Wash Custis built Arlington House, which, as you said, Cassie, became a popular tourist attraction because Wash had so many relics and former possessions of George Washington. And after Wash dies, he passes Arlington House on to his daughter, Mary Ann Custis, who's married to Robert E. Lee, who you may remember from our textbooks as the famed general of the Army of Northern Virginia during the American Civil War, which was an army that fought for the Confederate States of America. So Cassie, would you tell us more about Arlington House, how Wash built the house as a monument to his grandfather, and about the property's connection and relationship with Robert E. Lee?
Yeah, it's a tenuous connection, but one that people made at the time. There's actually 2 different books, the most recent one by Jonathan Horn on Robert E. Lee's connection to George Washington, and the fact that people saw him as, in a way, the heir of George Washington because he had married Wash Custis's only white daughter. In fact, Wash was initially opposed to that marriage. Robert E. Lee, he was technically a distant cousin of theirs, but his family was kind of notorious at this point. Jefferson referred to them as those insects. So hardly flattering. And Wash knew that Robert E. Lee was going to be a military officer, would be traveling. He worried about what that meant for his daughter. So he actually held out against that marriage for quite a while. But it's clear that Robert E. Lee and Mary Custis were in love. This was definitely a love match, although clearly a good financial match for Robert E. Lee. He's moving up in the world through this. So that marriage happens in 1831. And Wash has been established at Arlington House for a while at this point, although the house, he moves there, 1802. He's living basically in a cabin. He doesn't have the house finished until 1818. So all of the siblings, their houses take a while to build, Tudor Place especially too. So he has time to plan this to be a showpiece. And if you've ever noticed when you're in Washington and look across the river to Arlington Cemetery and see this building with the big columns on top of the hill, that's Arlington House. You can see it from everywhere in the city. And when you're up there, you can look out over the entire city, which I think is important that Wash Custis has this view of his adopted father's namesake city. And he has it built in a sort of early Greek revival style that's kind of unusual. It's more impressive from afar than when you get up close. And people said that at the time. It looks like it's made out of stone and it's not. It was actually fairly cheaply made. The house inside, you can tour it now. It has reopened after a renovation. And it looks bigger from the outside, I think, even than it does inside, but it's still an important property. Important to note that in his will, it goes to his daughter. She is the one that inherits it. This is interesting because in the mid-20th century, the U.S. government named the house, they added on to Arlington House, the Robert E. Lee Memorial. Robert E. Lee never owned this house. And Robert E. Lee also, as you mentioned, served as a general for the Confederate States of America, committed treason against the United States. So there actually is a campaign to remove his name from the house, just because it doesn't make sense to have this property named after him as a federal government property. But certainly it was very quick that after Wash Custis's death in 1857, and then by the time Lee decides to side with the Confederacy, the house is Lee's house. People have forgotten about Wash Custis. It's all about Lee and that Lee is a traitor. And the government ends up actually improperly taking the house and seizing it as federal property. The family later gets repaid for the value of it because of the sort of underhanded way the government got it. But yeah, it is a strange turn that, as you say, Wash, this great nationalist connected to George Washington, that the house he built becomes known as Robert E. Lee's house.
We've spent a lot of time today talking about how the Custises were fairly well known in early America. They were celebrities, but they are not household names in our present day. So how did the Custis grandchildren fall out of popular consciousness? And what do you think their legacy is, if we can find one to look at today?
I think Robert E. Lee is a big part of the answer to why we don't know who they are. Because in the sort of reshaping of American identity during and after the Civil War, both North and South, the United States and the Confederate States, try and co-opt George Washington. But certainly if you look at United States memory and attitude towards Lee, the Custises have become tied to Lee. And he has tarnished George Washington's legacy of supporting the Union. And actually, if you look, the Custis step-grandchildren's own grandchildren almost all fight for the Confederacy. So I think that's partially how they fall out of favor. I think it's also that once the original four kids who had that closer tie to George and Martha die, there's not the same tie with the next generation. They end up not having all the objects anymore. So Nellie's descendants sell their collection of Washington items to the Smithsonian. Some of the stuff at Arlington House gets seized by the federal government and taken, and some of it is actually part of the Smithsonian now. The family did get paid for it at a certain point. So they're also losing the objects. So I think it's a combination of things there that the next generation is not choosing to carry this on, doesn't have the knowledge and the objects, but also they're tarred with Lee's reputation by this point. In terms of what they can tell us, I wouldn't sort of suggest that they provide a model of what a first family should be, but I do think that they help us trace what happens in America between the Revolution and the Civil War. They're tied to so many big events and movements in a period where the ideals of the Revolution don't really come to fruition, where the Union ends up falling apart. because of the failure to live up to those ideals. And the Custis's are part of that process. They are not alone in participating in that, but they sort of show us the direction that the country went and some of the failures of the country in that period.
We should move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. Cassie, as you note in your book, First Family, one reason the American people favored George Washington as their first president was he didn't have any direct descendants. People didn't have to worry about a king or a hereditary transition of power because George Washington didn't have a son. So in your opinion, what might have happened if George Washington had had direct heirs? Do you think his role as a father and as a grandfather by blood relation would have impacted his politics and the politics of the early United States?
That's a really interesting question. And certainly John Adams at the time said, if he had had a son or daughter, all the European monarchs would have wanted to marry their kids off to George Washington's kids. So who knows? I don't think George Washington would have been thrilled with that. I do think it's fairly likely that if he had had a son, that son could have tried to go into politics. If you see with John Adams and John Quincy Adams, John Adams says many years later that he and George Washington wanted John Quincy to marry Nellie. And that would have tied those two dynasties together. So who knows, would he have tried to have a child of his married to another prominent Federalist family? Would that person have run for office? I do think it would have made people in the country less comfortable with him as the first president. I think it could have changed the question of calling him the father of the country, because a lot of the claims about calling him the father of the country are he has no children of his own, even though he raised children. So asterisk, he has no children of his own. So you Americans are his children. That's important to people. So I think beyond making them more comfortable, it's sort of part of how they see him as a father figure for the country. I also think just on a more practical, less national political level, it's quite possible he would not have freed his enslaved people if he had had a son or daughter, particularly a son. It is clear now that that was not just or even primarily a moral decision for him. It was an economic decision about what he thought the best form of labor was. And the fact, if you look at most of the people who manumit enslaved people in Virginia at this point don't have children, or else the famous example of the Carters, they have so much money that they're not financially hurting their children by manumitting people. So I do wonder, too, how that would have affected George Washington's legacy.
It's just like the Virgin Queen, right? Elizabeth I, who ruled England between 1588 and 1603, was the Virgin Queen because she was unmarried and childless. So the people of England thought about her reign as she was their mother and they were her children.
Right.
Also, I have to admit, I think we need to be a bit skeptical about John Adams's words about John Quincy marrying Nellie Custis, as many historians have reported that Adams's relationship with George Washington wasn't all that great.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny because that story about John Quincy and Nellie is something that he tells his daughter-in-law, Louisa, who marries John Quincy, like, did you know I wanted him to marry somebody else? So who knows? He's saying that in like 1820. So that's 20 years later.
Cassie, now that you've finished First Family, what are you researching and writing about now? Are you still researching and writing about relationships between men, women, and families?
To a certain extent, yes. I mean, I've always been interested in relationships and the way personal relationships have an interplay with politics. And I've spent a long time, pretty much since undergrad, thinking about women and political power. That is where I'm going on the next project, although I don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but looking at women's political power in probably the first century of the country, so from the Revolution to the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the way that women exercised power in all sorts of ways despite not having the vote. We tend to think of that as just like patronage, but looking at stories of women who were lobbyists, even hired to be lobbyists, which we don't tend to read about much, women who are managing presidential campaigns. I think that women had a lot more political power than we have recognized. And there's some great work on this, although it tends to be segmented by 20 or 30 year periods. So I'm hoping to tie a lot of that together. And so in a sense, women like Nellie and Eliza and Patty are players in that too.
Yeah, and I was also thinking about Martha Washington, Abigail Adams, and even Dolly Madison, right? Women within these presidential administrations who, because they were married to the president, also had a lot of political sway.
Yes.
If we have more questions about First Family or the dynamics of the Washington family, where or what is the best way to get in contact with you?
So I have a website, CassandraGoodHistorian.com, and that has information on events I'm doing and on the book, other things I've published, and a contact form. I am also now, in terms of on social media, on both Blue Sky and Instagram at CGoodHistorian. So people can find me there and follow me on those platforms.
Cassandra Good, thank you for joining us again and for taking us inside the intimate lives of George Washington and his family.
Thanks so much for having me. It was great.
George Washington did not have children of his own, but he did have stepchildren, step-grandchildren, and lots of nieces and nephews. As Cassie related, the Washingtons loved having children around their house, and at times they invited several to stay with them, all in an effort to keep Mount Vernon lively and to help out family members. The Washingtons lived in a time when early deaths happened frequently. According to the Encyclopedia of Virginia, Martha Washington's only son, John Parke Custis, Jackie, died at the age of 27 from camp fever, an illness that was prevalent in Tidewater, Virginia, and could have been either typhus or dysentery. Jackie's young death meant that his widow, Eleanor, had 4 young children to raise: Eliza, Patty, Nellie, and baby Wash. To ease the labor and emotional burden of raising 4 young children, the Washingtons offered to take in the 2 youngest children, Nellie and Wash. This is how the older Washingtons came to have 2 children in their household when George Washington became the first president of the United States. And like the children of presidents today, Nellie and Wash grew up as celebrities. Even without photography, early Americans knew who Nellie and Wash were. Washington family portraits with the children were created and sold and then hung in everyday Americans' homes. Nellie and Wash could also be seen by members of Congress and elite socialites in New York City and Philadelphia at social events, and as statesmen walked in, out, and around their home, the president's house. And after the Washingtons' deaths, as the 19th century turned into the mid-19th century, Nellie and Wash and their sisters, Eliza and Patty, became the last living links to the nation's revolutionary era as embodied by the Washingtons. As Cassie showed us, looking into the lives of the Custis grandchildren provides a window through which we can see the dynamics of elite white families during the nation's earliest days, and how those families confronted family deaths and child rearing. Looking into the lives of the Custis grandchildren gives us a glimpse into just how much of the labor of child rearing fell to enslaved people. It also shows us just how much work some people put into being members of a family. Nellie and Wash may not have been George Washington's direct heirs in a biological sense, but they were his direct heirs by his informal adoption of them and by the work that Wash, Nellie, and their sisters put into having the American people see them as Washington's direct heirs. You'll find more information about Cassie, her book, First Family, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. BenFranklin'sWorld.com/385. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts, so please tell your friends and family about Ben Franklin's World. Production assistance for this podcast comes from my colleagues at Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios, Jordan Hammond, Ashley Bachnight, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, what other aspects of the Washingtons or family history would you like to know about? Send me your topic requests. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.